Karen's face flushed with rage as she watched the black man next door change the Wi-Fi password. How dare he alter something that belonged to her community? Little did she know, her racist tirade was about to backfire in the most humiliating way. Karen marched over to the neighbor's yard, her lips curled into a nasty sneer. "Excuse me. What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, hands on her hips. The man, caught off guard, turned around slowly. "I'm just changing the Wi-Fi password. Is there a problem?" "A problem? Of course, there's a problem." Karen spat. "This is our community's Wi-Fi. You can't just waltz in and change it whenever you feel like it." The man furrowed his brow. "Actually, I pay my fair share of the bill. I have every right to change the password if I want to." "No, you don't." Karen's voice rose to a shriek. "This is our neighborhood. We make the rules around here." A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the commotion. The man held up his hands, trying to placate the irate woman. "Look, I don't want any trouble. I'm just trying to get online." "Trouble?" Karen interrupted, her eyes wild. "You're the one causing trouble, barging in here and acting like you own the place. This is our Wi-Fi, our neighborhood. People like you need to learn your place." The man's expression hardened. "People like me, huh? And what exactly do you mean by that?" Karen sneered. "You know exactly what I mean. You and your kind don't belong here. We work hard to keep this community the way we want it. So why don't you take your internet and go back where you came from?" A collective gasp went through the onlookers. The man's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing with barely contained fury. "Lady, you have no idea who you're messing with." "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Karen shot back, "and I'm not afraid of you or any of your kind. This is our neighborhood, and we won't tolerate your kind of trouble." The man's nostrils flared, and for a moment, Karen thought he might actually lunge at her. But instead, he took a deep breath and turned to leave, muttering under his breath, "Whatever. I'm done with this." As the man walked away, Karen couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. She'd put that uppity black man in his place, just like she'd done countless times before. Little did she know, her racist tirade was about to backfire in the most humiliating way. Later that evening, Karen sat smugly in her living room, scrolling through her phone. She replayed the confrontation with the neighbor over and over again, taking satisfaction in how she had put him in his place. Just then, the doorbell rang. Karen opened the door to find a uniformed police officer standing on her doorstep. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Davis. We've received a complaint about a disturbance in the neighborhood earlier today. Can you tell me what happened?" Karen straightened up, ready to spin her version of events. "Oh, officer, I'm so glad you're here. There was this terrible man, one of our new neighbors, who just barged in and started changing the Wi-Fi password without permission. I tried to explain to him that this was our community's Wi-Fi, but he just wouldn't listen. He became aggressive and belligerent, and I felt threatened for my safety." The officer listened impassively, jotting down notes. "I see. And did the neighbor make any threats or use any physical force against you?" "Well, no, not exactly," Karen admitted. "But his tone was very aggressive, and he refused to back down. I was truly afraid for myself and the other neighbors." The officer nodded. "I understand. However, we've also received a report from your neighbor detailing a different version of events." Karen's eyes widened. "A different version? But I told you exactly what happened." "Yes, ma'am. According to the report, you approached your neighbor in an agitated state, hurled racial slurs at him, and threatened him for changing the Wi-Fi password, which he had every right to do as a paying customer." Karen's face flushed with indignation. "That's not true at all. He's the one who was aggressive and threatening. I was just trying to defend my community." The officer held up a hand. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we have the neighbor's statement corroborated by several eyewitnesses. It appears you were the one who initiated the confrontation and used discriminatory language against him. Karen opened and closed her mouth, at a loss for words. But, he's the one who's causing trouble. He doesn't belong in our neighborhood. I'm afraid that's not how the law sees it, ma'am. The officer's expression hardened. Based on the evidence, it seems you are the one who committed a hate crime today. I'm going to have to ask you to come down to the station for further questioning. As the officer cuffed her wrists, Karen's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. She was the victim here, not that intruder. How dare they believe his lies over hers? But deep down, she knew the truth. Her own racist tirade had finally caught up with her, and now she was facing the consequences. As Karen sat in the back of the police car, her mind raced with disbelief and panic. This couldn't be happening to her. She was the one in the right, the one defending her community from an unwelcome intruder. How dare they arrest her for a hate crime when she was just trying to keep her neighborhood safe? At the police station, the officers escorted Karen to an interrogation room, where a seasoned detective began grilling her about the incident. So, Mrs. Henderson, can you explain to me why multiple witnesses reported that you approached your neighbor in an aggressive, racially charged manner? Karen's eyes narrowed. I don't know what those liars told you, but I was simply trying to protect my community. That man had no right to just waltz in and change our Wi-Fi password. The detective leaned back in his chair, studying her closely. But according to the reports, the Wi-Fi network belongs to the entire neighborhood, and your neighbor pays his fair share of the bill. He had every legal right to change the password if he wished. That's preposterous. Karen huffed. This is our neighborhood. We decide how things are run around here, not some outsider who thinks he can just do whatever he wants. The detective's expression hardened. So you're admitting that you confronted your neighbor based on his race and socioeconomic status, not any legitimate grievance. Karen's face flushed. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. I was simply trying to defend my community from someone who didn't belong here. I see. The detective folded his hands on the table. So in your mind, your neighbor didn't belong in the neighborhood because he's a person of color. Karen opened and closed her mouth, realizing too late how her words had betrayed her true motivations. That's not. Mrs. Henderson, the evidence clearly shows that you initiated a confrontation with your neighbor, hurling racial slurs and threatening him, simply because he had the audacity to change a Wi-Fi password that he was legally entitled to change. The detective shook his head in disgust. That, ma'am, is the very definition of a hate crime. Karen's heart sank as the gravity of the situation finally hit her. She had always prided herself on being a pillar of the community, someone who fought to maintain the neighborhood's high standards. But now, in the harsh glare of the interrogation room, she was forced to confront the ugly truth. Her actions had been driven by pure, unadulterated racism, and she was about to pay the price. As the detective continued grilling her, Karen realized with dawning horror that her well-meaning efforts to protect her community had backfired spectacularly. The more she tried to justify her behavior, the deeper she dug herself into a hole. And the worst part was, she had no one to blame but herself. As the interrogation dragged on, Karen's initial defiance slowly gave way to a sinking realization. She was in serious trouble. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and the detective's relentless questioning had stripped away her veneer of righteousness, revealing the ugly truth at the core of her actions. So let me get this straight, Mrs. Henderson, the detective said, his brow furrowed in disgust. You confronted your neighbor, a paying customer who had every legal right to change the Wi-Fi password, simply because he was a black man living in your neighborhood. And when he refused to back down, you proceeded to hurl racial slurs and threaten him, causing a disturbance that multiple eyewitnesses corroborated. Karen swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry. I was just trying to protect my community. He didn't belong here. The detective shook his head. That's where you're wrong, ma'am. He did belong there, and you had no right to harass him or deny him access to services he's paying for, simply because of the color of his skin. Karen opened and closed her mouth, desperate to find the right words to defend herself. But deep down, she knew it was a losing battle. The more she tried to justify her actions, the more she revealed the ugly truth at the heart of her beliefs. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm going to level with you," the detective continued. "Based on the evidence we've gathered, you're looking at charges of assault, harassment, and a hate crime. That's a serious felony, and you could be facing significant jail time." Karen's eyes widened in horror. "Jail time? But I was just trying to—" "Save it," the detective interrupted, holding up a hand. "Your reasons don't matter, ma'am. The law is clear on this. You committed a crime motivated by racial animus, and you're going to have to face the consequences." As the gravity of the situation sank in, Karen felt a wave of panic wash over her. Jail time. For defending her community, it was unthinkable. She'd always prided herself on being a respectable, upstanding citizen, the kind of person who made her neighborhood a better place. How could this be happening to her? But deep down, she knew the truth. Her actions had been driven by pure, unadulterated racism, and now she was being forced to confront the ugly reality of her own prejudices. As the detective continued outlining the charges against her, Karen felt her world crumbling around her. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was the victim here, not the perpetrator. And yet, the evidence was stacked firmly against her. As the gravity of the situation sank in, Karen's desperation turned to panic. She couldn't go to jail. That just wasn't an option. She'd worked too hard to build her reputation in the community to maintain the pristine image of her neighborhood. And now, all of that was at risk because of some interloper who didn't know his place. "Please, you have to understand," Karen pleaded, her voice trembling. "I was only trying to protect what's ours. That man, he doesn't belong here. He's going to ruin everything we've worked so hard for." The detective regarded her with a mixture of pity and disgust. "Mrs. Henderson, the only person who's ruining things around here is you. Your neighbor had every right to access the Wi-Fi he pays for, and you had no justification to harass him like that. But he's not one of us." Karen blurted out, her desperation overriding her better judgment. "This is our community, our way of life. We can't just let anyone waltz in and start changing things." The detective shook his head, his expression hardening. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but that kind of exclusionary, racist thinking is exactly what landed you in this mess in the first place. Your neighbor is just as much a part of this community as you are, and he has the same rights and privileges as anyone else." Karen's lip trembled, her eyes brimming with tears. "You don't understand. I was just trying to keep our neighborhood the way it's supposed to be. Safe, clean, orderly, the way we want it." "The way you want it, you mean," the detective corrected. "But this isn't your personal fiefdom, Mrs. Henderson. It's a diverse, vibrant community that belongs to everyone who lives here, regardless of their race or background." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but the detective held up a hand. "Save it. I've heard enough of your excuses and justifications. The fact is, you committed a hate crime, and you're going to have to face the consequences." As the detective outlined the charges and potential penalties, Karen felt her world crumbling around her. Jail time, hefty fines, a permanent criminal record. It was all so much more than she ever could have imagined. And to make matters worse, the realization was dawning on her that her actions had been driven not by a noble desire to protect her community, but by the ugly, insidious poison of racism. Karen had always prided herself on being a pillar of the neighborhood, a champion of its values and traditions. But now, in the harsh glare of the interrogation room, she was forced to confront the ugly truth. Her so-called efforts to defend her community had been nothing more than a thinly veiled excuse to exclude and discriminate against those she deemed unworthy. As the gravity of the situation sank in, Karen sat in stunned silence, her world crumbling around her. She had always prided herself on being a pillar of the community, someone who fought to uphold the neighborhood's cherished values and traditions. But now, in the harsh glare of the interrogation room, she was forced to confront the ugly truth. Her actions had been driven by nothing more than raw, unfiltered racism. The detective watched her closely, his expression a mix of pity and disgust. "You know, Mrs. Henderson, I've seen your type before. You think you're the gatekeeper of this community, the one who gets to decide who belongs and who doesn't. But the truth is, this neighborhood doesn't belong to you or any other self-appointed protector. It belongs to everyone who lives here, regardless of their race, background, or socioeconomic status." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her throat. Deep down, she knew the detective was right. She had always justified her actions as a noble effort to preserve the neighborhood's integrity, but in reality, it had been nothing more than a thinly veiled excuse to exclude and discriminate against those she deemed unworthy. "The problem is," the detective continued, "you've gotten so used to being the one in charge, the one calling the shots, that you can't stand the thought of someone else, someone different, having the same rights and privileges as you. And when your neighbor had the audacity to exercise those rights, you lashed out in the most vile, hateful way possible." Karen felt her face burn with shame and humiliation. How could she have been so blind, so arrogant, to believe that her actions were justified? She had always prided herself on being a champion of her community, but now she realized that her so-called defense of it had been nothing more than a mask for her own deep-seated prejudices. "You know, the worst part is," the detective said, shaking his head, "you actually think you're the victim here, that you were just trying to protect your neighborhood from some intruder who didn't belong. But the truth is, Mrs. Henderson, the only person who doesn't belong here is you. Not because of your race or background, but because of the toxic, discriminatory beliefs you've allowed to fester in your heart." Karen's lip trembled, her eyes brimming with tears. She wanted to refute the detective's words, to insist that she was the one in the right. But deep down, she knew he was right. Her actions had been driven by nothing more than pure, unadulterated racism, and she was now facing the consequences of her own bigotry. As the weight of her actions sank in, Karen felt a sense of dread and despair wash over her. She had always prided herself on being a pillar of the community, but now, she realized that she had been the one tearing it apart all along. As the detective's damning words sank in, Karen felt her world crumbling around her. She had always seen herself as the guardian of her community, the one who fought to uphold its cherished values and traditions. But now, in the harsh glare of the interrogation room, she was forced to confront the ugly truth. Her actions had been driven by nothing more than raw, unfiltered racism. The realization hit her like a sucker punch to the gut. All those years of pride, of smugly believing that she was doing what was best for her neighborhood, it had all been a lie. She wasn't a champion of her community, she was its cancer, slowly eating away at the very fabric that held it together. "You know, Mrs. Henderson," the detective said, his voice laced with barely contained disgust, "the saddest part of all this is that you actually thought you were the good guy, that you were somehow protecting your community from the undesirables, as if your neighbor, a law-abiding citizen who pays his fair share, somehow doesn't belong here." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her throat. Deep down, she knew the detective was right. She had convinced herself that her actions were justified, that she was fighting to preserve the integrity of her neighborhood. But in reality, she had been nothing more than a bigoted, small-minded bully, driven by an irrational fear of anyone who didn't fit her narrow, exclusionary vision of what a proper resident should be. "The thing is, Mrs. Henderson," the detective continued, "this neighborhood doesn't belong to you or any other self-appointed gatekeeper. It belongs to everyone who calls it home, regardless of their race, their background, or their socioeconomic status. And when you try to deny your neighbor his rightful place in this community, you committed a crime that goes against the very essence of what it means to be a decent, law-abiding citizen. Karen felt the weight of those words like a physical blow. She had always prided herself on being a respectable, upstanding member of the community, someone who fought to uphold its values. But now, in the harsh light of the interrogation room, she was forced to confront the ugly truth. Her actions had been driven by nothing more than raw, unadulterated racism, and she was about to pay the price. As the detective laid out the charges and potential penalties, Karen felt a growing sense of dread and despair. Jail time, hefty fines, a permanent criminal record. It was all so much more than she ever could have imagined. And to make matters worse, the realization was dawning on her that her so-called defense of her community had been nothing more than a thinly veiled excuse to exclude and discriminate against those she deemed unworthy. As the detective continued outlining the charges and potential penalties, Karen's mind raced with a mixture of disbelief, shame, and sheer panic. Jail time, fines, a permanent criminal record. It was all too much to bear. "You have to understand," Karen pleaded, her voice trembling. "I was only trying to protect my community, to keep it the way it's supposed to be. Safe, clean, orderly." The detective held up a hand, silencing her. "The way you want it to be, you mean. But Mrs. Henderson, this community doesn't belong to you or any other self-appointed gatekeeper. It belongs to everyone who lives here, regardless of their race, background, or socioeconomic status." Karen's lip quivered, her eyes brimming with tears. But he didn't belong here. He was an outsider, someone who was going to come in and ruin everything we've worked so hard for. "That's where you're wrong, ma'am," the detective replied, his expression hardening. "Your neighbor had every right to be here, to access the services he pays for, just like anyone else. The only person who doesn't belong is you, not because of your race or background, but because of the toxic, discriminatory beliefs you've allowed to fester in your heart." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her throat. Deep down, she knew the detective was right. Her actions had been driven by nothing more than raw, unadulterated racism, and she was now facing the consequences of her own bigotry. As the gravity of the situation sank in, Karen felt a sense of overwhelming shame and despair. She had always seen herself as a beacon of the community, a champion of its cherished values and traditions. But now, in the harsh glare of the interrogation room, she was forced to confront the ugly truth. Her so-called defense of her neighborhood had been nothing more than a thinly veiled excuse to exclude and discriminate against those she deemed unworthy. The detective watched her closely, his expression a mix of pity and disgust. "You know, Mrs. Henderson, the saddest part of all this is that you actually thought you were the good guy, that you were somehow protecting your community from the undesirables, as if your neighbor, a law-abiding citizen who pays his fair share, somehow doesn't belong here." As the weight of her actions sank in, Karen felt a growing sense of dread and despair. She had always prided herself on being a pillar of the community, but now she realized that she had been the one tearing it apart all along. And the worst part was, she had no one to blame but herself.